So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. Today we have our presentation on before and after suicide loss. I know that this can be a very challenging conversation to have. So I appreciate all of you who are able to join us, to be part of it, to be part of today's conversation and presentation. My name is Julissa. I am the Director of Programming for the Children's Bereavement Center. I'm also joined here by Reverend LeSueur from NAMI Miami-Dade. So today's presentation is in partnership with NAMI Miami-Dade. And Reverend Lisa is a suicide prevention coordinator for NAMI Miami-Dade. She also serves as the pastor of congregational and staff care at Coral Gables Congregational United Church of Christ, where she oversees their mental health ministry. She has earned her master's of public administration at Florida International University and worked in management for the Miami-Dade County Clerk of Courts in 2019. She also earned her Master's of Divinity from Chicago Theology Seminary and was ordained by the United Church of Christ. She is a certified Question, Persuade, Refer, or QPR, suicide prevention instructor. So we're very, very lucky to have her here today, and we're very excited to get this going. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Reverend Lisa.
Thank you so much, Julissa. Thank you all for prioritizing suicide and suicide awareness. There's so many other things you could be doing with your lunchtime, so I'm grateful that you've decided to spend it with us here today. What we're going to do is go through some facts about suicide. We're going to talk about a little bit about statistics. I'm not going to take a really deep dive into that, but just to give you a general idea about what the statistical landscape looks like in this country. We're going to talk just a little bit about some myths that still exist about suicide that we need to work harder at breaking through so that we can increase the conversation about suicide, making it, the more we talk about suicide and kind of normalize it as a lived experience that some people go through, the more inclined we're going to be able to reach those people with the hope that there is help for them. And once they have that hope, they're more inclined to get the help that there is. And then we're just going to talk a little bit about how you're going to talk to somebody who might be, well, we're going to talk about the warning signs a little bit, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how to talk to somebody who might be experiencing thoughts of suicide, and what some resources are available for them. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Julissa, who's going to talk more about grief. So I like to start, let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay. So I like to start my presentation by telling you a little bit about myself and why suicide prevention work is so critical to who I am and what I believe we need to have more of. And, you've heard a little bit about my background. I'm a pastor. I have 35 years of experience working in management for the clerk's office. And I'm now the suicide awareness coordinator for NAMI Miami. None of that took any mental health training other than to teach question, persuade, refer classes, which I do. The rest of my experience is all from lived experience, my own experience with mental health. And specifically with regards to suicide, that experience is kind of twofold. One, I'm somebody who's dealt with suicidal ideation since the time I was a teenager. I went through a lot of stress, a lot of hardship when I was growing up, a lot of feelings of hopelessness. And so at some point in my formative years, my go-to way of thinking when I was going through those times was, suicide. I would start making plans. I would start thinking about it. I never acted on any of those plans, thankfully, but it just kind of became this way that I would think about, during situations where, I felt so hopeless, I couldn't figure out another way out other than to maybe end my life. And so the importance of that is that, even though I've never acted on it, it increases my empathy and compassion for people who have that kind of thinking. And I also know that from my own experience, I never heard anyone else talk about suicidal ideation until just about a year ago, after I'd already taken this position with NAMI. And I was at a meeting with fellow clergy members when somebody I had known for years started talking about their experience with suicidal ideation and how they were going through that at this point. And I got to tell you, I mean, it was like, for me, excitement's probably the wrong word to use, but I never heard anyone else talk about it. They were talking about the exact experiences I had lived with all of my life. And so to hear somebody else express that made me feel like I wasn't alone. And that's so critical. And so that's what happens when we start talking about these things. You know, people don't feel alone anymore. And when they don't feel alone, they're more inclined to talk about it because we get through that stigma about it. So that's one of my important experiences with suicide. My second important experience was as a caregiver. I had been with my ex-partner for about 8 years when she started to develop serious mental health conditions. We would learn over time that the mental health conditions were kind of being triggered through some traumatic events that she had endured when she was growing up. As a young person, she had gone through some pretty horrific things. And, you know, I'm from a generation where the go-to thing wasn't that, oh, your kid goes through something and you send them to therapy. So she had never dealt with any of these things that she had gone through. She just kind of sucked it up, found a place to put it in her head, and went on with her life until one day she couldn't. This is somebody who was working in the court system as a supervisor, dealing with judges, dealing with attorneys, making those split-second decisions that need to be made in the court system. She was a meticulous dresser. She really cared for her appearance until one day she didn't. She became this person who instead wouldn't get out of bed, wouldn't change out of her pajamas for days, often wouldn't remember to eat or take her medicine. She did have a good caregiving team in the sense of a professional medical team that was helping her. She had a great primary care physician who was dealing with some of the physical health challenges she was going through. She had a great counselor who was trying to deal with that trauma that she'd experienced and trying to help her come up with more productive ways to handle that. And then she had a psychiatrist who was dealing with the medication, you know, trying to find the right fit of medications to deal with the symptoms that she was going through. They were all amazing. I had a great relationship with all these people. She was fine with me talking to them, and they were fine talking to me about what they were finding, what medications they were trying, what they were doing for different things that were coming up. They had talked to me about what diagnoses were. The one thing they never talked to me about was the fact that she might be thinking about suicide and what I should be on the lookout for in case that ever happened. And so one day when I came home from work and I found her in the living room with a weapon in her hand telling me she wanted to end her life, I got to say, you know, it's like the floor just kind of gave out from under me. It's such a shocking, awful thing to find that your person that you care so much for, the person that you love, is in such a state of hopelessness that they feel like they would rather end their life than try to keep going. And so I called 911. I had two amazing officers come that evening. They were very compassionate, very empathetic. They seemed to know exactly what to do to get her into the ambulance and get her to one of our local mental health intake centers where she would be Baker Acted. For anyone who isn't aware of the Baker Act, it's a 72-hour involuntary hold they put on somebody who's considered to be a threat to their own life. And so fortunately her story did go on from there. I mean, she lived, she got some help, and she's still alive today. And this is about 15 years later. But just going through that experience left me with some really strong feelings about what had happened. And one of those feelings was I was upset with the medical profession that had never put suicide on my radar. You know, I was the primary caregiver. I was the one that was taking her to doctors. I was the one that was doing most of the things at home. So if anyone was going to notice, it was more than likely going to be me. But they never talked to me about it. The second thing I was upset about was I couldn't help but wonder what was going on right in front of me that I wasn't picking up as being thoughts that or being signs that she was thinking about suicide. And I got to say, you know, as thankfully in this case, she went on and she did live, but I can only imagine that type of thinking for somebody who has lost their loved one to suicide. It adds like this extra layer to grief. So, you know, we all go through that normal kind of grief, that sorrow, that missing somebody when somebody dies. But, you know, with suicide, I find that there's that extra layer of grief that's created by those questions. And a lot of those questions we can never have answers to, like why, what was going on, what right in front of me, what didn't I see? Could I have done more? And in a lot of cases, people, you know, who did everything they knew to do and still lost their loved one. So it's just a very difficult type of loss. I had a gentleman come to one of my trainings who had lost his father when he was 8 years old to suicide. And this was 25 years later. And he still had those thoughts of, why wasn't I enough? What was it that what was so wrong with my father's life that he couldn't hang on for me and our family? And so these are the types of things that we're dealing with when it comes to suicide. So I just like to impress on everybody, suicide is preventable. It's everybody's business. We can't rely on just the trained professionals, because if they don't know what's going on, if they're not seeing signs of suicide, if no one's talking to them about that with this person, the person's not opening up about it, well, it may not be on their radar. So we can't make those assumptions. We need to know what some of the signs are and be alert to that with people who are in our daily orbit. You know, it could be somebody in our home, somebody in our workplace, our friend group, our faith community, any of the spaces that we travel in life. There's the opportunity or the possibility that we may encounter somebody who's thinking about suicide. So to be prepared for that, this will be a good presentation for you to kind of get the basics on how to deal with that. And I just want to end this part by saying, you know, I think all of us have been impacted in one way or another by the loss of somebody to suicide, either in our families, in our friend groups. And if it hasn't touched us in a personal way like that, we're certainly affected when somebody famous dies, right? Somebody who we admire, somebody we look up to, somebody like, you know, there's a whole long list of people who have died, who are famous. Robin Williams, Anthony Bourdain, Kate Spade. Recently, we lost Twitch. And when we lost Twitch, Tyler Perry came out, you know, the incredible actor and producer, and talked about his own experiences of suicide attempts in the dark days of his youth when he was living in poverty. He was living in his car. He hadn't made that big break yet. And so how grateful he was that he didn't die during that time. And so I would just ask that you think of a world without a great, brilliant person such as Tyler Perry to contribute to our entertainment and to our arts and to our culture, and all the people that we unfortunately have lost to suicide. And so that's why I think that these kinds of trainings are so important. So I'm going to begin by just talking again briefly about statistics. The last full year that they have completed statistics for is 2021. But the CDC just came out with provisional statistics for the year 2022. So I'm kind of going to go back and forth in my conversation because I want you to have the most up-to-date information that I have. And so in 2022, so far it's been estimated there's over 49,000 deaths to suicide. We're inching very close to 50,000. In 2021, that number was just over 48,000. So it's a 3% increase since 2021. I will also tell you 2021 was a 4% increase from the previous year. If you had a graph in front of you, you would see that the trajectory of suicide has just continued to go up. And it continued to peak until right at the time of the pandemic. And during that time, we actually saw a decrease in the number of deaths to suicide, which seems so counterintuitive to me. It seems like that was a time when we were all going through so much grief and so much loneliness and sickness and uncertainty. But what I found that when there's communal disasters and communal events like that affect everybody, it's not unusual for the suicide rates to go down for a while. But what we're seeing now is that we've come through the worst of the pandemic, and now those numbers are starting to spike again, and they're going higher than they've ever been. So that's a real concern. And it also kind of just reminds us how important it is that we all be involved and be observant and be helpful. The second statistics from this page I like to talk about is male versus female suicides. So as you see, male deaths by suicide are almost 4 times as high as that of females. And, you know, when I do these trainings, these QPR trainings, I always open up that question to people as to why they think that is. And so the standard answers I'll get are things like, well, you know, men don't talk about what they're going through. They have such, you know, they're the breadwinner of the family. You know, they're expected to just kind of suck it up and go on. The reality is the reason why we have 4 times as many men dying by suicide is that men are more inclined to use firearms. The reality is that women make 3 times the number of attempts as men. But when women attempt, they're more inclined to try hanging or poisoning or overdose. So you can't say that it's just a male problem. It's male and female. It has to be addressed across the gender. And then as we're going to see, here's just some general facts about suicide. Suicide's the 11th leading cause of death in the United States. Prior to the pandemic, it was number 10, but the pandemic has now taken the 3rd spot, and that's kind of pushed suicide down, not making it any less important to talk about, because as we see, the numbers are going up. Each day we lose about 132 Americans to suicide. And one of the visuals I like to use is like, think about when you go on an airplane and you see all those seats full, that's about 132 seats. Well, that's the number of people we're losing each day to suicide. We lose 6 people each hour just in this country. And it's estimated that for each suicide death that there is, that an additional 25 people make an attempt. So, you know, it's kind of staggering to think about. According to the CBC, it was estimated that in 2021, 12.3 million people had thoughts about suicide. And so there's years when I fall into that category of having thoughts about suicide. They also estimate that there were 3.5 million that made a plan. That's an incredible number of people who are being directly impacted with their own thoughts, their own actions, and then unfortunately, those who are going on to actually die by suicide. Again, we're not going to take a really deep dive here about ethnic group, but and this particular chart is a little bit misleading, and I'll tell you why. So if you look at this chart, it looks like suicide is a problem mainly for white populations, correct? I mean, it's off the chart basically for white populations. But that's before it's been adjusted by size of these ethnic groups. So of course, Native Americans are a much smaller group. So the reality is that Native Americans actually have a higher rate of suicide than white Americans. Not by a lot, but they do have a higher rate. So then you come up with our Black communities and our Hispanic communities and our Asian Americans, all again looking like it's not as much of a problem if you just look at the numbers. But some things I would say about that, particularly when it comes to our Black community, is that the numbers that we're seeing here have increased by almost 60% in the last 20 years. It's a phenomenal increase. And that's fueled primarily by deaths of young men that are choosing to die, or who are dying by suicide. And so I want to just emphasize that there's not any community that we can just say is suicide's not a problem. It's a problem across ethnic groups. It doesn't respect age, it doesn't respect ethnicity, it doesn't respect religious background. It's a problem for all of our communities. And so we need to do more to address that. And I'm so proud of NAMI Miami because we've just started a Black Communities Initiative where we're going into our underserved communities in Miami-Dade County to work on stigma, breaking through the stigma that is so strong in those communities. And so, we're doing different kinds of programming. The suicide prevention is part of that work that we're doing so that we can get the word out to people that, yes, these are real things. These are what you need to be on the look for. And here's where the help is that you can get. Here's a chart that goes by age. Again, this is just to kind of show you this has not been adjusted by population. This is just the actual numbers of people who died by suicide. The one hopeful thing about 2022 is we did see a decrease in suicide deaths in the 10 to 24 year age range. So that's critical. Suicide rates are always highest when adjusted for population size in our elder community, fueled mostly by the deaths of our males. Males are more inclined to die by suicide in the older community as well. And a lot of that is fueled by feelings of not wanting to be a burden, health issues, loneliness. It's not just one thing that's contributing to that. It's kind of a conglomeration of things that are happening. I will say that on the slide that I use for when I do my QPR trainings, there's actually another category of ages 5 to 14. That's the most tragic category that I know of, because that means that there's 5-year-olds in this country presenting to counselors, presenting, to families with thoughts of suicide, plans for suicide, and unfortunately, all too often carrying through with those plans. And so you see that sometimes. I've seen it several times on the news lately where, a young person that would fall in that age range died of suicide because they were being bullied at school. And so, kids that age don't have their brains haven't fully formed to understand that, these things, tomorrow could be a better day. Things aren't always this awful. And so instead of telling anybody and trying to work through it, they're unfortunately making the decision to end their life. And this just tells you what the statistics were in 2021 for the state of Florida. We had over 3,000 suicide deaths. There were about 228 in Miami-Dade County. The state of Florida has not updated any 2022 statistics, so unfortunately, I was unable to get that for you. As I mentioned, I think it's important that we talk some about the myths of suicide, because if we're ever going to break through the stigma, we got to put it out there. We got to, these things that people believe that they've been taught. We need to break through that and replace the myth with the fact. And so probably the number one myth that exists about suicide is that asking someone about suicide will plant the idea in their head. There's been extensive research that's proven that that's not the case. From what I've learned is that talking to somebody about suicide, being open with them, first of all, taking the time to have a conversation to try to find out what's going on with them. And if that conversation leads to suicide, talking about suicide, what generally happens is, people who are thinking about suicide, it's like thoughts have just been kind of building up. That pressure's kind of been building up in their head. And so it gets to the point where, that tension is just so much. It's kind of like a balloon that's been blown up too much, where, it's about to break because, it just can't take anymore. Talking to somebody, putting it out there about suicide, having these conversations actually lets, that air start coming out of the balloon. And the more air we can get out of the balloon by having somebody talk and express what they're going through, the more hope can get to them, the more possibilities for hope to reach them. And the more hope reaches them, the more inclined they are to go and get help. And so that's what our goal is, to teach people how to, be bearers of that hope. And it's something that we can all do. Another myth is most suicides happen without warning, or people considering suicide keep their plans to themselves. Well, we wouldn't have, we have a whole list, and it's not even a comprehensive list of warning signs that we're going to go over today. 80% of people who go on to die by suicide give off some sort of warning in the days and weeks prior to their suicide attempt. So being alert and knowing what to look for can change the whole outcome of a situation. Another myth is that only a professional can help somebody who's thinking about suicide. Nothing could be further from the truth. Any one of us can be in a position to help. In my instance, in the situation I shared with you, the professionals weren't any help prior to the suicide attempt. After they knew, after she made that attempt, they knew that that was something that she was thinking about, and so then they could act on it. But up until that time, they weren't any help. And so that's, again, another reason why it's so important that we are alert to this and that we understand, we see, and we have a willingness to talk to somebody who may be going through something. People who are suicidal or who die by suicide are selfish. This is one that always gets to me, because I can tell you from experience that when I have been in those spaces where I've been thinking about suicide, I could honestly say I thought that the world would be a better place without me in it. I was not doing it for a selfish reason. I can understand how somebody might think that, but in that moment of despair and distress and hopelessness, the idea that I'm contributing anything of value to the world is very far from my thinking. And so it's not a selfish act. It's something that people do out of desperation. Most people don't want to die, but they don't know any other way out of their situation, out of what's happening, to make them feel so unhappy, so hopeless. And then the last one is, once a person has made a suicidal attempt, they will always remain suicidal. And again, if somebody gets the help that they need, the reality is the majority of people go on and they live their life without ever thinking about suicide again. And so our goal is to be able to intervene and get them that help so that they can go on with their life, build up resilience, learn new coping skills, and go on with their life and enjoy whatever, their life has in store for them. So let's talk a little bit about warning signs. So let's break it down into 3 different groups. We're going to talk a little bit about verbal warning signs. We're going to talk about behavioral warning signs. And we're going to talk about situational warning signs, things that happen to people in their lives that can sometimes make them feel hopeless, can sometimes make them feel like life's just not worth going on. But let's start with some verbal warning signs. So, what you're going to hear is like this thread of hopelessness that goes through these. So something like, I can't go on anymore. I wish I were dead. Everyone would be better off without me. My life is no longer worth living. If things don't get better, I might as well not be here. I don't want to be a burden. I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to commit suicide. And I like to talk a little bit about the word commit, because it's how many of us refer to the act of somebody dying by suicide, right? It's very common when somebody dies by suicide you hear it in the news, you hear it preached in churches. It's just very common to refer to it that way. The problem with using the word commit suicide is that it adds a criminalized intent, which comes from centuries of people thinking of suicide in terms of it being a sin, it being, self-murder, something that somebody's intentionally doing to, against God. And so it got that criminalized stigma. And so when we talk about, trying to open up the conversation about suicide and mental health in general, language matters. And so if we can take the word commit and change it to, they died by suicide, just like they died of cancer, or they died of heart disease or diabetes, any other way of death that's on this huge spectrum of ways people die, it's more humanizing. It's more compassionate, it's more empathetic, because now we know so much more about suicide, and we realize that many times the act of suicide comes from a space of somebody who's dealing with a mental health condition. Not all the time, and I don't want to quote you a figure because I've seen two very different figures as to how many people are estimated to have a mental health condition when they died by suicide, but to know it's over 50%. So if that's, fueling a lot of what's going on here, not all of it, we need to be more compassionate, and we need to be careful about our language. Somebody could also just say, I'm going to end it all. Some of these things are very apparent. If somebody says, I'm going to kill myself, it's very clear what they're intending. Something else, if things don't get better, I might as well not be here. That's kind of beating around the bush, not coming right out and saying it, right? But that thread of hopelessness is running through that. It's something we should be listening for. The other thing, somebody might say something like, if such and such doesn't happen, I'm going to kill myself. So that such and such can be something like, well, if I don't pass my courses this semester, if my boyfriend doesn't ask me to marry him, whatever it is that's so important to that person. Now, you being on the receiving end of this conversation may be listening to it and saying, I don't understand why they'd want to kill themselves over something so such as that. But the reality is, and a lot of people who've never had the experience of thinking about suicide find it very hard to understand how somebody would want to end their life. And so it can be easy to kind of be jumping in and being a little bit judgmental about it, and, saying things like, suicide's a stupid idea, why would you be thinking about that? But you don't want to do that, because what you want to do is find ways to open up the conversation, not close it down. So if you refer to suicide as a stupid idea, or that's dumb, or I would never think of that, I would never do that, that's all things that kind of shut down a conversation. So again, just to be kind of careful about how we might talk to somebody who's in that situation. So some behavioral warnings include withdrawing from activities and friends, giving away prized possessions, increased alcohol and drug use, putting personal affairs in order, acquiring guns or stockpiling medications. If the person you're talking to is known to have had a previous suicide attempt, then your concern level is ramped up, because the likelihood that they might make another attempt is high. Feelings of hopelessness, sleeping more or less, extreme mood swings. Any of those types of behaviors are concerning. And then some situational warnings that we have. A breakup of a relationship, a death of a loved one, particularly if that was by suicide, loss of income or financial security, loss of employment, expelled from school, expected punishment, or loss of freedom. We often hear of prisoners who take their life. Recent serious medical diagnosis. You can also add to this fear of becoming a burden. So I just want to stress that the appearance of one or two of these warning signs doesn't necessarily mean that the person's thinking about suicide. People go through breakups all the time. People lose jobs all the time. They don't think about suicide, However, some people who go through that situation do. So even, even though, you might not have thought about, you may have gone through something similar and not have thought about suicide. It's always just good when you're seeing somebody going through some sort of major loss, or saying things that are kind of threaded with that hopelessness. Check in on them. Just have a conversation. Hey, I'm noticing some things. I'm concerned about you. Can we talk? It might be, even if that person's not thinking about suicide, they may be going through, a mental health crisis where they need to get help, and maybe you can help facilitate them getting that help. I just wanted to put this slide in, just because the warning signs in teens are sometimes a little different than they are in adults. So you might see acting out behavior, running away, unnecessary risk taking, physical complaints such as upset stomach or headaches, obsession with death and dying, problems focusing, feeling bored, or lack of response to praise. So for those who work with young people, these are some extra concerns that you might want to be on the lookout for.
Lisa, I think someone wanted to see the behavioral warnings slide again. Would you be able to show that?
I think so. Give me a second. This one?
This one. Okay, maybe we can allow a little bit of time for people to take a look. Any questions on this specific slide?
No, thank you. I got it.
Okay,
Awesome.
great.
So let's talk a little bit about how to talk to somebody about suicide if you're having these concerns that something's going on with them, and just how do you open up that conversation? And let me just kind of undergird the whole thing with empathy, compassion, and hopefulness. And that hopefulness comes from the fact that there is help. There is help for people who are going through these types of things, who are struggling with suicidal ideation. And so knowing that and knowing how to open up the conversation with them is crucial. So you can start a conversation with something like, you haven't seemed like yourself lately. What's going on? If you want to be specific about what you've been seeing, hey, you've been showing up to work late, and you seem like you're kind of disheveled, like maybe you're not taking care of yourself. You could say something like, are you okay? I've noticed you've been coming to practice lately, or wherever this situation, the context of the situation. I'm concerned about you. Let's talk. I've been worried about you. Let's get a cup of coffee and talk about it some more. I feel like you might be going through something. Would you like to talk about it? Any way that's comfortable for you to start the conversation. I can't emphasize enough, though, if you've noticed warning signs, your gut's telling you that something's wrong, don't hesitate, act. And I can tell you from personal experience the importance of that, not putting something off. Because when I was working with Miami-Dade County, I was a manager. I had an employee that worked for me for years. And for the whole time I knew him, he was bipolar. He was taking medication, but he would often go off his medication because he was concerned about the side effects. He was concerned about what he was doing to his liver. His family was trying to convince him to go off his medication. He was a great person. He was a great worker. He and I got along so well when he was on his medication, and I could always tell when something was off, and maybe he had stopped taking it. Well, he came to my office one day, and it was a bad day for me. I was in the middle of something when he came, but something was telling me that something was wrong with him. And I made this mental note to talk to Paul later. Well, my day took off. I never had an opportunity to go back to it. What I found out later was Paul left at lunch. He went and picked up his kids from daycare. He got in a car and went on 995 and drove into the back of a semi-trailer. Paul died instantly. His son was brain damaged, and his daughter, I think, had some minor injuries. Paul was going through talks of divorce where his wife was trying to get custody of the kids. While there's no definitive answer as to whether it was suicide or an accident, most people were kind of thinking towards suicide. And I can just tell you, when I got the news of that, it gutted me because I felt responsible. I knew, I saw what was going on, and I let my day get away with me without going back and talking to him. And so to not have to live with that type of guilt, if you see something, say something. Get the person in a private place where you can talk. Allow yourself plenty of time for the conversation. Let the person talk. It can be hard to get them going to talk. People can be, pretty reserved. They may not want to open up. It's mental health related. People don't like talking about their mental health. Keep at it. Just show that you are somebody who is caring, wants to help, compassionate about what they're going through. And then let them talk. You're listening for more clues about what's going on. What is their thought process? Could it be that they're thinking about suicide? Is this somebody that I need to ask the question? You're engaging in that active listening, giving that person your full attention. And, giving people your full attention is more than just, eye contact. It's your whole body language. People need to know that no matter what's going on in the world at that moment, this conversation that you're having with them is the most important thing to you and that's going on at the moment. Be non-judgmental. That goes back to that whole, you may not understand suicide. You may not understand how somebody could think that, but just being careful with language. You may not understand, their particular situation. Oh, she's feeling like this because her boyfriend broke up with her. Well, I don't get it. Keep that to yourself. Your role in this is to listen to what the other person is going through and how they're perceiving it and how they're responding to it. Avoid interruptions if possible. Keep your cell phone turned off. Offer hope in any way you can. And a lot of the hope comes with saying something like, I want you to live. I'm on your side. I can help. I want to help. I know where we can call to get some help. And then just stay calm. This is just a conversation you're having.
Lisa, before you move on to the next slide, there was a couple of questions that came through the chat.
Okay.
The first one being, you talked a little bit about this earlier when you were presenting the statistics, but maybe you can expound on it. It says, any research why the suicide rate is so high among white community compared to the others?
Well, again, when you look at the rate of suicide, it's, Native Americans are actually higher. They have a higher rate when you adjust for population size. And that's fueled by a lot of hopelessness, a lot of drug use, alcohol use, loss of identity, those types of things. I don't have a clear answer on why it's so high in white communities, except that I believe, and there's most people who deal with these type of statistics will say, all of the statistics that we deal with, the numbers are actually probably much higher. And so when you're dealing with communities such as Black communities, Asian communities, Hispanic communities, where stigma is so high about mental health, somebody dies, there has to be proof that somebody died of suicide. Part of that proof comes from interviewing family members and people who were around them. There has to be concrete evidence that it was a suicide for them to record it as a suicide. In communities where stigma is so high, there's less inclination for family members to admit that their loved one was talking about suicide or was dealing with something mental health related. And so the more likely response will be that it will get recorded as another kind of death. So that plays into it as well.
Thank you, Lisa. Then there's another question. What is a proper age to speak with students at elementary school about suicide?
That's a really good question. I think I've talked to my daughter about it. My daughter's 15 now. We started those conversations in middle school. And not giving them the full, you know, picture of it, but just the idea of what is suicide, have age, related conversations with them. I think it is crucial that we talk to our elementary school kids about mental health. In fact, at the church, I did a program where we had this book that Gizmo's Pawsome Adventures, I think, where it was a little dog, and he talked about keeping, how you can maintain your mental health and care for your mental health, much the same way we do our physical health. And so that kind of introduced the kids to that type of, thinking of, oh, I can go for a walk when I'm that mad, or if I'm sad, or I can go call a friend to go play. Simple things like that to just get them in the idea of talking about it.
Thank you. And there's just a comment. There needs to be more training across the board, organizations, communities, because of the stigma of not knowing how to speak to someone who might be suicidal. For example, in schools, if a student begins to express feelings to a teacher or administration, they are automatically brought to the school counselor. All people need to feel comfortable to say something.
Exactly. And I will tell you that part of my portfolio is going to community organizations, faith communities, workplaces, and offering what's known as QPR, question, persuade, refer, suicide prevention training. It goes through a lot of the material we're going through today. It's an evidence-based program that talks about how we can all be bearers of hope in situations of suicide, people thinking about suicide. I was going to talk about it at the end of the presentation, but since you brought it up, we can do it on Zoom. We can do it in person. If anybody on this call has any interest in bringing a presentation like that to their workplace, faith community, any kind of community organization in Miami-Dade or Monroe County, please reach out to me, because we would love to do, we've done quite a few this month. The word is getting out there. We're very excited about that. And so, but it's not just this month, it's all throughout the year. So please consider that as part of, your planning for the year.
So those are all the questions and comments. Thank you, Lisa, for answering them.
Okay. So ask the question. So you've been talking with somebody, you're really very concerned about them at this point, just from what they're saying and, maybe the scope of what they're going through. Ask them the question. Are you thinking about suicide? Have you been having thoughts about killing yourself? Have you thought about harming yourself? Whatever way is comfortable for you to ask the question. If they say yes, the two questions you're going to want to follow that up with: do you have the means to carry out? Do you have a plan? And do you have the means to carry out the plan? If somebody has the means, if there's a safe way of removing the means, do so. Never put yourself in a situation where somebody has a gun and you try to take that gun from them. But if it's, say, you're having this conversation somewhere else and the means is maybe at home and there's somebody at home that can remove it from the house, then, that's a great way to do that. I want to emphasize that over 50% of suicide deaths are gun related. So if you have a weapon, secure that weapon. There are gun locks that you can have it out of reach. If you know somebody in your home is going through a mental health crisis or just has a mental health condition, secure that weapon somewhere where they can't get to it, because you just wouldn't want to have to deal with the consequences of something happening in that type of situation. So how do you help? For one, if they've been having this conversation with you, and again, whether it leads to asking the suicide question or not, if they've been opening up to you, thank them for that. Thank them for trusting you enough to open up. Tell them you want to help them get help. Offer hope and reassurance that things can get better. Provide information about resources and offer to help to make that call. And we're going to go, I have my final slide is about resources. So we'll go through that in a minute. Tell them you care. You want them to live. You're vested in this. You might want to find out if there's other people in their, family or friends, or if they have, a safe community, other people that you could reach out to be part of a team that can help support this person during this time. And then, regardless of how much you can lean into this, like say you might be, in my instance, I was the primary caregiver. So I was the one that would take her to the doctors and get the information and whatever. Well, that's not possible for everybody, of course. And it's not even where the person might want you to be. But, be involved to the extent that you're comfortable being involved. And no matter what, follow up with that person after the conversation, keeping in mind that this person has relayed this really heavy information to you. They might have been holding it for quite some time. They're on their way to getting help, but it's important that they know they didn't scare you off, that you don't think less of them. So however you're comfortable communicating with them, be that stopping by for a visit, giving them a call, sending them a card, do that. Because that way they'll know you're still thinking about them. Caring is so critical. Showing somebody that you care is so critical. And the value of that can't be overstated in terms of, the possibility that might be what saves somebody's life. The reality is some of us are surrounded by people, but no one notices when something's going wrong, right? So you might be that one person who is noticing. So don't ever take for granted that, oh no, there's other people in their life, they're dealing with it. Always take the time to have a conversation with that person. And so for the last few minutes of my portion, I just want to go over some of the resources that we have in our community. Very important to know the distinctions here. So if somebody is actively in the process of making a suicide attempt, don't try to disarm them. Don't try to get in the middle of it. Call 911. Ask for a crisis intervention team officer. The crisis intervention team are the officers that have received extensive training in mental health. There were several years ago, there were several, high profile experiences here in Miami-Dade County where unfortunately a desperate family called out for officers to come. And when they came, their loved one ended up dead or very injured. And so the whole point of the crisis intervention team is so that we don't see those types of incidences. They're trained to know how to disarm a situation, diffuse a situation, and get a person to help so that they will, be able to get the help that they need and, hopefully go on and live their life. The second thing that we have is 988. 988 is the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. It's a fantastic resource. It's staffed by trained professionals who know exactly what to do to handle these types of situations. So if it's, if you're calling about somebody else, if you're calling for yourself, it's the number will go through that national number, that 988 number, and be routed here to our local community where the resources, where the counselors know exactly what our resources here. They'll listen to exactly what's going on, and they will connect you with that particular resource. And that could be one of our mental health facilities. It could be, they might tell you that the person, is stable for now. I mean, there's just a million things that they could tell you based on your situation. One of the tools at their disposal, but it's also at your disposal as well, is the West Care Miami-Dade 24-hour mobile response team that we have. It's a mental health mobile response team. This is not for somebody who is actively in the process of making a suicide attempt. It could be for somebody who is having thoughts of suicide. It could be somebody who is going through some severe anxiety or depression, and the family doesn't know what to do to help them. you call the West Care unit. It generally comes to the house or the workplace or wherever that person is within 45 minutes to an hour. They'll do an assessment and they'll determine what the next best steps are for that person. In Monroe County, it's run by Guidance Care Center, same theory. And then we also have 211 number here in Miami-Dade County, which is, it has mental health resources, but also a plethora of other information about community help that you might need. I will also, just going back to 988, I just want to emphasize that it's not just for people who are thinking of suicide. It's anything mental health related that you may need help with. So it could be addiction, it could be depression. You know, the counselors there will assist. And last but certainly not least, I want to talk a little bit about NAMI Miami. Again, just to emphasize, if you are interested in having suicide prevention training brought to your workplace, your faith community, anywhere that you have a gathering of people, please feel free to reach out to me. We would love to connect with you. But we also have a lot of other services. So one is a warm line that's staffed by a peer, regular business hours during the week from 9 to 5. A peer is somebody who has a lived experience with mental health. We have a variety of support services that we can connect you with. We also offer a variety of support services. So we offer support groups. Right now, they're all online. Soon to be, we're going to start rolling some out in person. But we have support groups that are in both English and Spanish. There are peer support groups that are led by a peer, somebody who has a lived experience with mental health condition. We have for family members who have navigated, you know, having somebody in their family who's dealt with a mental health condition. We have a young adults group. We have a Black communities peer group. We're hoping to get an LGBTQ support group soon. So it's just, you know, all of this information is available online at namimiami.org. It's all free to the public. Please check it out. If you know anybody who needs, would benefit from connecting with a support group, it's a great way for them to get some additional help. And also we have a program called Ending the Silence, where we go into the schools, middle school and high schools, with a program that introduces young people to the idea of mental health and, again, taking care of their mental health. And it has a young adult who has a lived experience with mental health. So it's always very popular with young people to hear somebody that's not much older than they are, who's gone through that and is in recovery, and just the idea that recovery is an option, that, you know, mental health is not, you know, mental health conditions are not the end of the road. So that's also an amazing program that we have. And then just one more that I just want to do a shout out about is our peer mentor group. It's a new program that we've started where we do one-on-one meetings with people to talk to them about hope and recovery and kind of come up with plans for them to help them. There's one for family and one for peers. Again, this information is all online at namimiami.org. And so I just would highly recommend you check us out. And with that, I will turn it back to Julissa, who is going to talk a little bit more about the grief aspect of losing somebody to suicide.
Thank you, Lisa. Before I start my part of the presentation, we do have a couple of questions for you. One has been, any of those programs that you mentioned for NAMI, are they in any other languages?
We do have it in English and Spanish.
Okay, great. And there was another question on, I'm not sure if you would have the answer for this, but what is the percentage of people who do talk about suicide and then follow up with action?
Yeah, I don't have a concrete answer to that. But, you know, when you see that, you know, for every person who dies by suicide, there's 25 more thinking about it. That kind of gives you a general idea, or 25 other people make an attempt. So the numbers really are much higher than what we're seeing as far as deaths are concerned. So.
Yeah, it might be a challenging question to answer at this time. Thank you so much for all that wonderful information. So we have about 30 minutes left in our presentation today. So thank you all for sitting through that. Right now, we will be transitioning to a little bit about what happens if you do lose someone to suicide, what that looks like, what to expect, and how to support someone who might be grieving the loss of a loved one due to suicide. I know that this can be particularly challenging. Lisa just went over some amazing tips on how to prevent this from happening, but unfortunately, there are so many losses due to suicide. So it's important for us to talk about grief and what that grief looks like. Again, I'm Julissa. I am the Director of Programming for the Children's Bereavement Center and the From Loss. And we'll actually start talking a little bit about what is a traumatic loss. So a loss due to suicide is really considered a traumatic loss. So we need to consider the circumstances of the loss. Sometimes the losses can be sudden, unexpected, and violent, which can create a very different experience for these grieving individuals. These factors increase the degree of shock and trauma experienced compared to other types of losses. So we need to really consider trauma and its influence on grief, on the grief experience. A lot of times these individuals are both processing trauma and processing grief. Survivors may also struggle to make sense of what has happened, which can complicate the grief experience for them. Traumatic losses can also create post-traumatic stress. So if the person witnessed the death or found the body, they may suffer from flashback or nightmares. They may have these traumatic responses, and this can also happen even if they did not witness anything, if they did not observe anything. The griever can imagine what may have happened, and that's enough to cause some traumatic stress. So you don't need to necessarily witness the traumatic death to have post-traumatic stress response. One's own imagination can get ahead of us, right? So they may think of what it looked like, they can imagine a lot of things, and this causes a stress reaction. Survivors of traumatic loss, such as suicide loss, may also struggle with a lot of questions after they've experienced this loss. So they may focus on, what did I miss? Lisa touched on a lot of this as well. What I didn't know, how could I have prevented this? And if only I did this, if only I was there, if only I saw all of these signs. There's so much blame that is self-blame that is placed on the individual, that they placed on themselves. So unfortunately, many people fail to find answers to these questions, and they keep searching and struggle to make sense of the randomness of this type of death. They may also imagine what it might have looked like for that person in the moments of their death. So negative thoughts about guilt and self-blame can impact how a person adjusts to grief, and is often associated with feelings of depression and anxiety as well. So exploring these questions, is very critical to explore these questions. These are questions that can be revisited over and over again, years even after the loss. Grief doesn't have to have a set time frame, so people can still process this during significant periods that are reminding them of this person. And these grievers either need to accept that they will never find the answer, or find an answer that will give them some sort of solace and peace. The answer may not be 100% satisfactory, but it can be something that they can hold on to and give them some sense of meaning, and can give them some sense of peace. If there is difficulty in resolving these questions over time, it can diminish self-esteem and confidence in itself, and it can create a prolonged and significant mental health problems for these individuals. It could complicate and it can lead to complicated grief. So we talked a lot about the stigma. I think a couple of you mentioned it in the chat. Lisa mentioned it. There's so much stigma when we talk about a suicide loss. So suicide often carries the stigma of weakness, blame, shame, sin. It's a crime. One important aspect of grievers due to those survivors who are grieving the loss of a suicide is the stigma and isolation they experience. So after a suicide, it's normal to feel confused. They may feel helpless, angry. They may have a lot of guilty feelings and many other emotions, really. These complex responses to a death often make the grieving experience complicated, and it's not easy, especially due to the stigma and all of those unanswered questions that we talked about before. These stigmas can also prevent those grievers from seeking the help that they need, and also talking about it with those in their support system, because they are afraid if they talk about it, people are going to be judgmental. They're going to be thinking a lot of negative thoughts about them. There can be a denial also that the death was a suicide, and Lisa touched on this. Sometimes it's really unclear whether it's a suicide or not, but there can also be a denial. However common suicide is still stigmatized. So this complicates the person's ability to talk about it with those that are there to support them. Isolation, again, is a common experience for those who are grieving. They might be worrying about upsetting other people. Grieving after a suicide can be a very lonely experience. It can feel like no one else understands, and it may seem easier to isolate than to ask for support. And grievers may struggle to share feelings because they're afraid of what they are feeling inside, right? So everyone grieves very differently. Everyone experiences grief in a different way. They talk about it in a different way, even when they are attempting to process the same loss. There's really no right way to feel or grieve or process. You know, these things just happen. These emotions just come up. And after a suicide, people might experience shock and trauma from the nature of the death. And other responses may include, you know, feelings of abandonment and rejection and betrayal and shame. It may be difficult for some to identify these feelings, and they could experience a lot of emotional numbness in that process. So there are some lack of privacy issues that can come up during the investigation process. A lot of times this can complicate a person's experience of grief. There's a lot of things that they are not aware of. There are some legal factors that complicate the grief due to suicide. So dealing with the police and the legal system can be traumatizing on its own. And when there's a death by suicide of a loved one, it can lead to a lot of privacy concerns, things that may come out. Sometimes there might be media involvement in the process, and unwanted media involvement. There might also be waiting for confirmation of the death, what happened, confirming whether it was a suicide or not. It might be challenged to recover the body sometimes. And it's definitely very challenging if someone finds the injured person or the person that died in the process. And being notified can also be a really difficult experience for a lot of these grievers. A lot of times the police are not very sensitive to the mourner's process, right? So they might just say things that are traumatizing for these individuals. And a lot of the nursing and the medical staff may not have the training to have these types of conversation with grievers who have lost someone due to suicide. So they may be seen as rigid or cold or insensitive to these grievers. There are also factors that family members may not have been aware of. So there might be things that they find out during the investigation process about their loved one that can be shocking for them. And finally, identifying the body, viewing the body for the first time can result in a long-term traumatization for the griever. And blame, I think that's probably a big factor. We keep repeating that. And blame is such a prevalent emotion after this suicide loss. In some cases, family members may blame the therapist, they may blame the physician, they may blame other healthcare providers for what has happened. They may also direct blame to their friends, to the person's life partner, to the deceased themselves for dying by suicide. It's also common for them to just blame each other in the aftermath of suicide. I wanted to also just take some time to show you a griever's response. I think if you have the time to finish this video, I won't obviously show the whole thing, but you can hear some of the self-blame and guilt that is common in those who are grieving the loss due to suicide.
When I was 23 years old, I stood at our church pulpit and delivered the eulogy at the funeral of a man who was dedicated husband, father, farmer, and friend. A man who was respected by his community and beloved by his family. That man was my dad, and my dad died by suicide. I remember the day of his funeral vividly. It was the second day of January, the beginning of a new year. It was bitterly cold, like the step outside and your breath is taken away type of cold. The type of cold that makes you not want to be anywhere else but in your home. The type of cold that could leave your hands and feet numb. And the cold perfectly described how I was feeling at the time. My dad's death took not only my breath, but a piece of my heart away. I really didn't want to leave the house that day, and certainly not for his funeral. And no matter what anyone said or did, I was numb. I am so thankful that I practiced his eulogy over and over again because my eyes were so welled with tears that I couldn't even read the paper of words in front of me. Nothing could have prepared me to stand up in front of my family, our neighbors, and our friends and use my words to beg them not to let the way my dad died, a result of debilitating depression and anxiety, diminish the legacy of caring and compassion he left behind.
So I'll stop that there. I think that last part is very significant for those who have experienced the loss of a loved one to suicide. It's the way they died. They're beyond that. They're more than that, right? So understanding how depression impacts a person who has died by suicide can help the griever know the process, understand that a lot of times it is a depressive condition, right? So one thing in particular that is important is the language. As Lisa mentioned before, we want to avoid using committed suicide, and we want to move away from that language as it just signifies something bad happened, when really this is something that the person has been struggling with. And we also want to talk about how depression impacts the body and the chemical imbalance that happens. So as you can see in the image on the slide, brain activity during periods of depression, which is the one on the left side, with normal brain activity on the right, an increase of blue or green colors along with decreased white and yellow areas showed the decreased brain activity due to depression. So understanding the brain activity can help remove some of the griever's guilt or self-blame and understand that this person wasn't thinking clearly. They weren't they had lost their perspective when they were making this decision. So it can help those left behind understand the process that they may have been experiencing and answer some of those questions as to why they made that decision. So how do you support those who are processing the loss of a loved one due to suicide? Most important, there are a couple of things that can help them as they are processing this loss. So we can start with developing some self-capacity. So self-capacities are their inner abilities that help people regulate any internal state. So any emotional regulation work, any work on self-worth, and any interconnection. So interconnection touches on it allows for people to carry positive image and memories of their loved ones, even if the loved one's not here. In our groups, we talk a lot about that continuing bond and continuing connection with that person, because we have lived a lot of experiences and we have a lot of memories for them. So being able to continue those relationships, even though they're not here. Survivors are encouraged to be creative in thinking how they can create those bonds as they move forward. And when we talk about self-worth, adequate self-worth doesn't mean never feeling bad about yourself. I think people think, oh, well, if I have self-worth, I'll never feel bad. But it does mean that even when you feel bad, you know or can recall that you're still reasonably a good person, even when bad things happen. So it can help a lot of those who have experienced a loss due to trauma, and it can encourage them to surround themselves with others that can create a sense of love and care and support them in the process of grief. And of course, we talk about emotional regulation. Emotional regulation is really for those who are traumatically grieving individuals. They may feel pain. The pain that they feel is very unfamiliar to them. And this pain of losing this loved one can come up suddenly, it can be unexpected. And so being able to regulate these emotions is very important. And this starts with recognizing what is it that they're feeling, what is it, can they name it, can they reach the point where they can accept these emotions without allowing them to become overwhelming. We talk about coping skills, and I'll talk a little bit more about coping skills in the next slide. So identifying coping skills is so important, but also identifying obstacles to those positive coping strategies when it comes to the grieving process. Some grievers are reluctant to engage in coping activities because they feel guilty. I'm here, the person's no longer here. I don't want to focus on myself, and I'm feeling better because my loved one's no longer here. We also talk about social support, surrounding yourself by family and friends. Social support is so important. Social and emotional support is so important to help people feel loved and cared for under times of stress. So whether that means turning to family, to the community, to support groups, whatever can encourage that. And some people may struggle with their spirituality after a significant loss like this. Many survivors may become engaged in sort of an intense and prolonged struggle to make sense of what's happened. And this may challenge their belief systems. So allowing themselves to sort of go through that experience and maybe seeking help from their spiritual leader can help them in this exploration as to how they can reconnect. Others actually connect with their spirituality or religion even more as a way to process their grief experience. And after a traumatic loss, their values and goals might also change. So what does that look like? Allowing themselves to do that value work. This value work helps people choose to move forward in a meaningful direction and become engaged in activities that they view worthwhile, even though the person's no longer here. So I talked a little bit about some coping mechanisms. Sometimes we engage in positive and negative coping strategies. So being aware of what are some positive strategies that people are engaging in or trying to engage in. So obtaining information. A lot of grievers really would like more information on what is suicide, what happened exactly with this person. So that might be helpful to some people as long as it's not super overwhelming. They might engage in rituals and traditions that can be helpful for them if they're grieving the loss of a loved one. And they can also benefit from engaging in creative expression of grief or processing those grief emotions. So it could be through art or music. We have a lot of art and music therapists in our groups, and they're really amazing in allowing both the children and adults process these types of loss. Some people also choose to volunteer as a way to give back. Maybe volunteering in an area where their loved one was particularly passionate about. And of course, engaging in positive self-care activities is always important. And understanding the impact of the grief and that has had on the self is important because it looks very differently for everybody. So not judging how it looks for you versus what it's looking like for anybody else. There are also some anti-coping responses that some grievers do engage in, and we have to be aware of these. Some may have some emotional numbing behaviors. They may avoid some strong emotions after a loss. They may do this by drinking, over drinking. They may have substance use issues. They might engage in overeating. Even excessively working out can be a way to numb themselves to avoid feeling the grief. Avoidant behaviors are also common to see. Sometimes it is easier to do this immediately after a loss, and grievers may be focused on other things like the funeral arrangement, other things other than feeling this grief. And you might actually see some kids might even improve their schoolwork, their grades, because they're focused, they have something to focus on. So they may engage in avoidant behaviors in order to not process their grief and loss. We talked about isolation and withdrawal, and grievers might also engage in compulsive and obsessive behaviors to avoid the grief process. So they might be engaging in risky behaviors, and this is something that should be noted, especially in teens who are grieving the loss of a loved one. So this is a little bit about the grief experience for those who have experienced the loss of a loved one due to suicide. I wanted to open it up for questions before I talk a little bit about the services that the Children's Bereavement Center provides.
Lisa, you have one question that just came in the chat about the mourners process.
Yeah, so the mourners is the grievers process, whatever experience that they're going through. Again, that looks differently to everybody, no matter what type of loss, no matter if they're grieving the same person. It's just a grievers process, and it is a lifelong process. Honestly, there's no timeline for that. It will be sort of a continuous reevaluation of where they are in their grief, and they would have moments where they will feel that grief very intensely, and they will have other moments where they'll be able to move forward and sort of have a different life goals, even without that person there.
Thank you, Julissa. I know NAMI also went ahead and they posted, and Julissa, if I can, I'm just going to go ahead and jump in, and then our staff can also post in the chat, but we're running out of time and I want to be mindful of that. But thank you, Lisa. Thank you, NAMI Miami-Dade County, for being here. Lisa, that was wonderful. And Julissa, thank you so much. You and I have been talking about this presentation for a long time. I'm Deborah Albus-Steiger. Let me back up. I'm the CEO of Children's Bereavement Center. An LCSW myself, and I've worked in schools for many years. This topic is very important to CBC, this month in particular being Suicide Prevention Month. And our partners at NAMI Miami-Dade County are so critical for us because we know how important it is, both before preventatively and afterwards. And that's why this was so important. And Julissa and I searched far and wide. We did not see anyone else in the country doing this type of presentation where you're talking about the prevention and we're also talking about those afterwards, which is prevention too, right? And that's why we work so well with NAMI. We refer to NAMI's groups because mental health is something that is 365, and we want people in the community to never feel alone. If they have mental health issues they're going through or they have family members, they should be going to NAMI's peer support groups. And vice versa, NAMI refers to us when there are losses, and that can be complicated by suicide, by mental health, and so on. So we're constantly referring to each other, and I'm very proud of the Susan and Susan team over at NAMI, their CEO and their president, because we know how important it is to work together. So thank you, Lisa, very much. That's amazing. To all of you who've joined us today, I want to say thank you because it is critical, absolutely critical that you are all in this conversation. And yes, I thank you for pointing out Broward County as well. We do serve all 3 counties, and actually Monroe too, we're expanding to, and Broward and Palm Beach also have their preventative lines as well, and NAMI Broward and NAMI Palm Beach County. Thank you, Phil, for adding, and you can look in the chat for Phil's information about the LOSS team. We want to, of course, be sure that you're aware of our grief support groups, and we went ahead and we put that information in the chat. Thank you, Amanda. To my friends who are working with elementary school kids, I've been there. I was a school social worker when I had a 6-year-old come to me and say, I saw the movie Stuart Little. This was many, many years ago. I was an intern, and I saw when Stuart covered his picture in a family picture and how the family looked happier without him. I did the same thing at home, and my family looked happier without me. He was 6 years old. And to hear that, and I was only 22. This was my first internship. I was fresh off the boat of undergrad. The first thing I did, so if you are working with little ones, is I talked to my supervisor and I talked to the parents. That wasn't mentioned, but you really need to with little kids. The younger they are, the parents must be notified. The guardians must be notified. You need to talk to them. And it could be as subtle as that. And that young man was brilliant. He was very into Harry Potter. He was a 6-year-old who had read all 7 books. And thankfully, he received the help that he needed outside of school. So I'm grateful to all of you. And you'll hear me say this often, but when we're working in schools or nonprofit agencies, it is very easy to feel alone at your job. And oftentimes, you're right, the school counselor, or if you're the social worker at the organization and the only one at the organization, people will come to you with everything in between, which is why you want to engage NAMI to come out and do this presentation, because everybody should be aware in that building what suicidal ideations look like. Everybody needs to understand that, and knowledge is power. And once you feel more comfortable talking about this, then as a community, we're all in a better place because we're all here to help each other. You'll hear us say this over and over again, but no one can do this work alone. Nobody should grieve alone, and nobody should do suicide prevention alone. This isn't a NAMI. This isn't a CBC. This is an entire community everywhere coming together to help each other. So thank you all for taking the time today, for being here. Really appreciate that. And we want to make sure that we're continuing to have these lunch and learns quarterly. Julissa, thank you for planning it. Lisa, again, thank you for being here. It was amazing. Julissa, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Deb. I just wanted to really briefly touch on how to register for a group. Amanda has posted in the chat. If anybody is interested in joining our grief support group, they're 100% free. We have groups for children starting at the age of 4, teens, and adults, and there is no wait list. They can join our group at any time. So they can just call our 8889 that's on the screen, or email us at support@childbereavement.org. And I just also wanted to briefly point out that we have our Steps for Healing coming up, is our 5K, our annual 5K at Zoom Miami. A lot of grievers really enjoy joining that event because it's a great way to remember those who they've lost. So if you would like to know more about it, please go to stepsforhealing.org. So important. And finally, I want to share in the chat our survey. I'll also email this to you for today. please take an opportunity to complete the survey for today. We want to hear from you what else you would like, what other type of lunch and learns you would like for us to have. These are free for you, so we love to hear from you. I'll also send an email to everybody that joined in with the survey link. But that is all for today.